Hello, everyone. You are listening and watching simultaneously, I hope, Silicon Curtain and Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I'm joined by Jonathan Fink. This is our fourth episode. I'm so excited. Jonathan, how are you? And by the way, you're in Ukraine. You're in Odessa. Incredible.
I'm
I'm
in,
so
I'm in
impressed.
Odessa. How can I not have a
Wow.
smile on my face? I've had a wonderful lunch and a wonderful dinner. I had Crimean Tatar food for lunch, and I had Bessarabian food for dinner. And it doesn't get much better than that.
Wow. I don't even know what Crimean Tatars eat. That's but I'd like to find out one day. All right, then tell us about. Let's take a look at some good news. There was a lot of talk that until Muscovites become aware that there is a war, this war is not going to end. And
Yes.
we are starting to see that Muscovites and the people in Russian cities are noticing, especially Muscovites, because of Aeroflot and all of the troubles that they're having with getting people to leave the airport on a plane. And to me, that's a major inconvenience. It's not the same as a Tomahawk missile striking Kremlin, but I think it's a real hassle for people. Hassle. At the same time, I heard of another story in New York Times, possibly today, writing that some because drones use maybe using mobile connection, mobile lines, that Russia actually takes down its mobile networks daily sometimes, and it's big inconvenience for people once again. Is there hope, do you think, that we can really make Russians so inconvenienced that they'll stop fighting war?
Well, this is it. If we're trying to appeal to moral sensibilities, then I think we can do that till the cows come home. But if we inconvenience people, if we ruin their privileges, and let's not forget, people who are traveling abroad are in a relatively small percentage of Russian society, very relatively privileged portion of society, or if they're traveling on business, again, they're going to tend to be in a kind of a sort of demographic which is fairly elite, and of course that they will have a sense of the status that comes with that, and what we're doing. This inconvenience is also a big dent to their status, which they feel they're entitled to. So I think bringing on more of this, and I think we were speculating last time that is this going to form part of a consistent Ukrainian strategy? And I think we decided that it is because Ukraine they don't take these one-off gestures of just let's shut the airports down for a couple of days and then move on to something else. This is part of a strategy, and what we saw today in the hack of Aeroflot's database. And a lot of the media are just talking about, oh, the number of flights cancelled today, etc. Well, it's far worse than that because they've actually wiped terabytes of data off the Aeroflot systems, which could take a long time to resurrect that. So this is a huge systemic hit on the ability to fly within Russia. Certainly using that sort of main national carrier, Aeroflot. So this now seems to be a consistent strategy to hit Russians where it hurts in their privilege, and hit them also where it hurts in the economy, which will have a knock-on effect on the war economy. It's a smart strategy.
I think it is, and it's utilizing the tools that Ukraine has at its disposals. We're hearing more and more stories about different drone systems. There's a 10, 20, 30,000 drones that are being shipped from Arizona, a company of AI drones. And it's just that's the way the world works today. I think ever since the Operation Spiderweb, it kind of forever changed what is now considered possible, if not acceptable. And you're absolutely right. I think that relying on moral imperatives is just a losing proposition with people with their entire culture going against those kinds of feelings and the weakness of morals and trying to show just strength. And I think that as long as Ukraine is showing strength, whether it's is by inconveniencing people or by erasing the data or just forcing Russia to take down its mobile device, cell system, then it works. I agree with you that it would be probably a bad idea, frankly, to say, well, we tried that, let's do something different. But at the same time, I wonder if Russians kind of like learn the lessons and protect things better, or not. That's
I
an
On its own, I don't think it will. This isn't a silver bullet. In fact, I don't think there is a silver bullet. But as Ukrainian friend pointed out this evening, like this is going on, and this is getting a lot of attention because this is like headlines. It's the same as will come to, I guess, Navy Day being cancelled. That's not going to have a huge knock-on effect on the war or any effect on the war, but it's a huge psychological impact on the sense that the regime is powerful or in control. It's hitting their sort of prestige, their pride, and this perception of strength and showing them to be weak.
or could
But
could possibly be. Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, there's another one though, because what gets less attention is that Ukraine has been striking logistical hubs that are absolutely part of the military network of transporting equipment. They've been systematically hitting the electricity substations and key nodes on the transport infrastructure that is actually critical to supplying Russia's army. So people might say, yeah, well, all this civilian, inconveniencing, it's all very well, but if it's then combined with a two-pronged strategy of also hitting the military infrastructure, then I think we've got, the start of a multi-pronged plan that could work.
Well, but I also see this as a kind of a several prong, because the IT component of hacking into this is a big vulnerability that can occur, that can take out any number of Russian institutions, starting with Aeroflot, but it could go far beyond that. So I think that the dangers that this could be spreading, and it's like a crack in the glass, and it just kind of goes in all directions. Where you go, this one drone attack means that now they can do this, and this. Oh crap! And they broke in and erased terabytes of data. It means they can do this, and this. Oh crap! I think it makes sense for Ukraine to exploit its strength and its abilities, and the inconvenience factor. It's not something, I agree. I got to tell you, I asked ChatGPT what it thinks are the chances that Ukraine will win war this year. And it said like 5%. I was like, okay, what are the chances that Russia will stop fighting this year? Like less than 10%.
Yes.
Okay. So I think that if we look at this kind of a permanent movement from both sides, then I think it's the worst thing can happen is attempt at a status quo, because you have to just always be pushing and gaining the initiative and gaining the dynamic and the wind at your sails, because otherwise you're pulling back. But at the same time, we see that Russia is not able to move forward, but the stalemate, I feel, is just kind of going nowhere. So the things that are happening clearly are having an impact, and whether it's going to raise that number from 10% to 11% to 15%, I think that those percentages can grow faster than we can imagine if if Russia is not able to fight, if they're losing their supply routes, and this is one of the big questions of how do you get rid of, how do you defeat Russia? Where's where's the testicles? So we'll see. Yeah, right.
All this is based on the assumption that Putin has a reverse gear, that he will stop the war. I think if he hadn't made such a colossal mistake and then doubled down on it, there is a scenario, perhaps in 23, when he could have said, okay, special military operation is finished, right? We've achieved our goals. We're kind of coming home, or we're going to fall back and entrench the lines on Donbass. And he probably could have got away with that, because at that point, they hadn't appointed Belousov. They hadn't totally retooled their economy. But at this point, they have. At this point, they have absolutely burnt their bridges. They've retooled the economy to be a war economy. They've built this huge kind of financial Ponzi scheme behind it, which means that the minute you stop the war, that economy is going to implode, a collapse like a house of cards. Now, I know people get very frustrated, and I have comments on the video, oh, this again, Russia's collapsing, blah, 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 cry wolf, tell us another one. But Putin has created an extraordinary, systemic weakness within the Russian economy, which means that I think when it goes, it's going to go, like a fault line opening up.
Well, that's how Soviet Union went. So I think that it makes sense that when it says suddenly for a while and then all of a sudden.
Tsarist Russia. I mean, Tsarist Russia imploded in the same way in 1917. That was just, It was
And
there
that's
1 minute
really
and
why
gone the
is it
next.
fundamentally, to me, it's because there's no elections. Because when you have democracy, when you have scheduled change of power, then you go, okay, well, we got to live with this for the next 4 years, and then hopefully we'll have somebody else. Like we had George Bush Jr., who started war in Iraq, and then Barack Obama was elected on the idea that he will stop the war in Iraq, and then 3 years later, he stopped the war in Iraq. Like all of that takes time. But now we have a president who announces that this is Biden's war, and I'm not, it was before me, I don't care. And
Yeah.
I'm going, dude, you're not running a hotel.
Yes.
This is a country. Like, just because the last manager didn't, accepted these coupons doesn't mean that you don't have to accept the coupons. Like, you're in charge of a country.
I mean, if it's a hotel, are we talking Basil Fawlty here? We're talking Fawlty Towers, aren't we, really?
Fawlty Towers, right, exactly.
Yeah,
John Cleese was much better than the characters we're dealing with
yeah.
now.
I'm going to say something kind of controversial here because I don't know what Trump's position is, but today he announced that it's no longer 50 days. It's clear, he said, that Putin has done nothing to change and will not change. I'm finished talking to Putin. He's got 10 days. This is very curious language, and I don't quite believe it will amount to anything. Having said that, it's taken 6 months to get here. It's taken 6 months to realize that Russia's not serious about peace. And you and I could have said that on day one, but obviously people have to learn these things themselves. They have to learn it the hard way. And, he's not unique in that, honestly. I mean, there are a lot of politicians, unfortunately, who do the same thing and make the same mistakes. But I didn't think we'd ever get to the point where he would announce that he's done with Putin. Now, whether we take that at face value or whether we have serious doubts about it, but it's still interesting nonetheless. And then you've got, Rubio, who's been saying some epically weak things. Of course, as you'd expect, all the lackeys are falling in behind and now repeating what Trump says, except for Vance, of course. Vance is curiously quiet.
Actually, there's a nice article about Vance in Politico, I think, today, that discusses how he managed to find a place for himself without overshadowing Trump, because God forbid. But I think that in all of your analysis, I did not hear word Epstein. And being in the United States, we start with that now, because we go, oh, you're trying to shift attention from Epstein. Okay, how are you doing it now, Mr. President?
And like 90% of the headlines I heard earlier. I watched a Bulwark sort of
Oh yeah,
segment on
Bulwark
that.
is great. I'm a big fan, but it's such a stupid idea to get involved in this scandal for Trump, because I feel like there's an infinite number of stories that are going to emerge about him and his formerly best friend Jeffrey Epstein, and everything that he is doing. It's kind of ironic that it seems like Epstein and the Republican Party is going to be with Trump until the end. But there's interesting discussions here whether ending war in Ukraine and in Gaza will distract people's attention from Epstein case. And it's almost like, what do I have to do for you people to stop paying attention? When
move on, move the agenda on, for goodness sake.
And it's interesting because we're dealing with people who are involved and became interested in politics not because of policy, but because of their visceral concern for these elites that are like taking advantage of children. And really, that there's two Americas, which is something that John Edwards many years ago was running on, the idea that there's two Americas. Well, Epstein became to symbolize the two Americas, the privileged and the rest of us, them with their private islands, and then the rest of us. And so when Marco Rubio and when Trump makes these statements about 10, 12 days, we go, are you trying to distract attention? But if not, or even if you are, now what? I was kind of thinking that 50 days was not necessarily a bad thing, because it actually kind of created a certain amount of certainty. Because one of the things that was happening with Trump is a total chaos and unpredictability. And I guess it was just too consistent for too long. And so he had to, go in there and say something. But at the same time, it's clear that Putin is not going to stop. Trump is just learning this. He thought that because Biden wouldn't talk to him because Biden wasn't Trump, and Trump is amazing and Biden's terrible, then, of course, as soon as Trump shows up, Putin's going to be like, yay, we can stop this war now. And it's funny because apparently no matter how far the West will bend before Putin, he will not stop. This is, I
No.
think, a very important realization that we have from all the things that Trump was willing to give. No NATO, everything. And Putin's like, no, I just want Ukraine. It actually kind of shows to a certain extent that the ultimatum of whatever 2021 was a fake, that he really didn't really care about any of it at any point, because Trump was very much willing to try to give it to him now, and it doesn't even work.
I mean, the sort of, the pro-war guys like us, so that's slight irony, of course, those who are pointing out that this really isn't about NATO, and that the whole argument of NATO being an aggressive imperial alliance, it just falls apart on closer inspection. Russia is surrounded by NATO. Has anyone looked at a map and seen that NATO actually borders, a minute percentage of Russia's extraordinary border, and by far that is the most stable point of their border, and they know it because they will never be invaded from NATO territory. Never. They're fully aware of that. It's China and other borders that they've always had much more historic paranoia over. So this NATO was a huge red herring. Finally, Putin's actions and even his words are giving that away. He's not even hiding it anymore, that this is an imperialistic, almost genocidal war. I say almost, it's definitely genocidal. But I mean, his language, he sort of resisted being overtly genocidal for a while. But even his language and that of his sort of acolytes and minions is overtly genocidal as well. So they're not even pretending.
But it's interesting going back to Trump, screaming about this is Biden's war, because Medvedev issued some kind of a missive directive, or whoever writes for him, and it ended with "Don't follow Sleepy Joe." So I think Russia is saying that A, we're not going to stop, and B, it's not your war, Donald. You go and play golf. We're going to finish this thing here in Ukraine. It's not. Don't be like Sleepy Joe. Go away.
I have no idea what's going to happen there. But Ukraine's smart. I mean, we'll get onto the protests and stuff in a minute. But I think, despite some of the issues in the Ukrainian government, despite the issues in every government in this situation, the sort of sluggishness, the bureaucracy, sometimes, innovations get overlooked. And these are the things you hear all the time. They do understand long term that they cannot rely on anybody else fundamentally for their own existence. And I think they started investing in the sort of very creatively in this drone warfare already in 23, when things started to get a bit bogged down, as it were, when they clearly didn't have the equipment, and there was pressure put on them not to take the Russians on too quickly. They were encouraged to consolidate the territory they take and not go further, when perhaps they could have routed the Russian army at that point. But that's all sort of academic. But once it got bogged down, I think they decided rightly that they can't rely on anybody. When they get aid, it's wonderful, right? And they're appreciative, and they do say thank you, and they use that aid very effectively. But I think fundamentally they're counting even now on the idea that they may get nothing from anybody at some point, and they have to plan accordingly.
I think it's good that there are drones, because there are things that can be planned, because otherwise, without this new technology, it would have been difficult. And of course, we can credit Donald Trump for having made everybody else see the light, that America isn't always going to come to your rescue, because there was people who were talking about it, but then it takes Donald Trump to come out and prove it, that you can rely on the United States. So I think that's a realization. I know that I was in the Ukrainian info space giving interviews since 2022, and explaining that what Biden was doing was insufficient, but more than anything could possibly, that way more aggressive than we can reasonably expect from an American president in this situation. And that when Trump comes to power, it's going to be far worse, because just that's how they are. And it's nice that from you and from other people, I'm hearing that this realization finally sunk in. But for years, people were arguing with me, partially because it's good for a conversation, like different points of view. But there were also Kremlin voices, or, saying, oh, Trump's going to come to power. I don't want to say Kremlin voices. That's a little presumptuous of me. But let's say, because they're looking for people from the United States who can tell or share American perspective.
Yeah.
Vast majority of Russian speakers in the United States, vast majority are Trump supporters. So it wasn't even too difficult, but they found somebody and a couple of people who were promoting the idea that Trump is going to come and rescue everybody. Didn't work. There's one character that is kind of hilarious to me because he at the same time strongly supports Ukraine and Trump. And so that really, I feel like, made him marginal in the MAGA movement in spite of his best intentions, because they just don't play that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think
But
that
there's
it's nice
plenty
to
of,
hear that there's this
Republican.
realization.
Yeah, there's plenty of pro-Ukraine Reaganite Republicans who are also telling me, I'm not a Trumpist, but this is how it's going to go down. Putin's going to insult him. He's going to realize, and then he's going to give Ukraine everything they need to give Putin a big, smash in the
Like,
face.
I buy the first part of it, but not the second part.
Yeah. But even that took a long time. I mean, they were visibly mocking him, denigrating him on Russian state TV almost from the day he was elected. Not even almost, the actual day he was elected.
Yeah.
They did a mocking video with about Melania. And there's some interesting, juicy theories as to why they did that. But they've been doing this from day one, and he's clearly thought that if we give Russia everything that they are asking for, then we'll take that at face value. So I think, interestingly, this idea that Trump is transactional, I think he genuinely believed he could do a transactional deal and that it was relatively simple, and it just rested on a bunch of things which, if you strip away the morality of it, then it's just a bunch of things, you give it to them, it'll all be over. I think he really thought it was going to be that simple.
It might be. We have the listener viewer says the new South Park episode was great. Yes, it was. It was really incredible. And for those that didn't see South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, you definitely should see it, because then you'll understand the references in this episode even better to Saddam Hussein and Satan. But we're in interesting times in the United States, where most popular comedy late night show, Stephen Colbert, was officially let go a year from now, but at the same time he's now pushing the envelope every night, trying to get fired currently in the meantime. Making himself like
faster.
Right. So I think that there's some humor out there in all of this, which is important to be able to find once in a while, because I don't know, how is it in Odessa? Are there drones flying around?
No, there were two alerts though. One was I get confused about when they actually were, but it was not last night, because yes, last night I almost ended up sleeping on the beach because I missed the what they call commandant Sketchas, or the curfew. I couldn't get a taxi in time, and I thought I'd have to sleep on the beach, but I didn't. Unfortunately, I found a friend had a spare room I could crash on, so I didn't get arrested or fined, which is great. That's good in the war. Not getting
That's something that I found also when I was in Ukraine, is that I was hanging out with people and I had like an hour left until Komendansky chess and the curfew, and it was too late to find a cab, and I was like, oh, that's it. And of course, people help, and one of the expressions I learned in Ukraine, the нет неразрешимых проблем, there's no unsolvable problems. But at the same time, I feel like that's where corruption starts, because there are no unsolvable problems, just a little bit more. But Ukrainians are very, you found a solution. I'm not surprised.
Well, one of the guys suggested, he said, you can get back to your hotel. It's just take one of these summer cuts. So I'm like, that I'm not doing that. I'm not going to go on a scooter in a curfew, trying to evade, patrols. That sounds like a very bad idea.
Yes, I actually remember being in the car driving by patrol to my place where I was staying, and we drove past somebody, a young man on a scooter, and the patrol, they rolled down the window and they yelled "Ukhilant," which means didn't serve, somebody who is escaping the front. So slacker. Yeah, there's a thing. War is an amazing. It's a different world than I live in, and kudos to you for traveling there and documenting it firsthand.
So it's an extraordinary place. I mean, we did have 2 air alerts And unusually it was already light. So one was I think at sort of 5 a.m. or something, and then the other one was already at 7 a.m., which is unusual because normally they're at night time. And I think those were shaheeds spotted somewhere. But it's been pretty quiet, although walking is not scary. You know, the normalos to go there. It's a lovely place. I mean, we when I came earlier in the year, it was absolutely quiet because there was a conference on and there were lots of bigwigs in town. And I think I think the Russians realize that it'd be very bad to kill some senior foreign politicians. I think they hold off when they know these things are happening, and they do know they're happening, because as soon as all the bigwigs had left town, they absolutely hammered Odessa the very night that they thought most people would have left and gone back. But I just missed it. I just missed it here. So I mean, they hit the main historic market just a couple of days before I came out. So if anyone knows these sort of large kind of farmers type markets where people bring honey and meat and stuff in, and it's got quite a bit of a buzz there, they hit the main historic market, and it's basically trashed. And that was just before I arrived. And some of the really big buildings in town, some of the big buildings that are like museums and former aristocratic palaces and so on, I mean, most of them are boarded up, and I don't know whether that is to protect them or whether they've been seriously damaged and the windows blown out. But you've got the sort of the plywood over all the historic windows. I did visit the Fine Art Museum. That has been indirectly hit. They said I think 8 times. One was very serious. It sort of blew the sign off the wall, and quite a bit of the sort of plaster off some of the adornments. Didn't damage any of the artworks, fortunately, but there was lots of glass and plaster in the galleries. And so they've got pictures of all that and how to repair it. Now the collection is safely stored away somewhere.
Well, that
Underground,
seems
I
like
think.
a nice continuation of what we see Russia do, which is fight culture with drones and with rockets, and they're fighting Ukrainian culture with because Russian culture is supposedly the only one. It's an interesting place, the Russia, and I think I find it difficult and troubling when I talk to Americans, and if I mention that I am from Russia, and this is why I started saying that I'm from
Mm.
Mordor, because people go, "Oh,
Oh.
Russia, it's just so mysterious, incredible." Like, oh my god, so it's a difficult challenge of being from a place that others have this kind of a strange, mysterious feelings towards that are pretty positive, and yet at the same time you're like, no, it's not really like that at all. And I think that the culture of death is really an important part of Russia. They're the memento mori. This always, whether whether you're in the war, whether from alcohol, you're gonna die either way. So even Putin said that. So it's and one of the ways that I explain to Americans how to look at life like a Russian, imagine I say that there's no such concept as a happy old age, because in Russian that really doesn't exist. So how do you live your life if you don't think that you're gonna have happy old age?
And if you get to old age, it certainly is not going to be happy. That's oh boy. I did one of the first things I saw in Moscow, which just made me double up with laughter, but I also found it quite sinister. There was this small old man with a cane walking down the street, just walking down the street, very, very slowly though, but he was in the middle of the street, so it's difficult to get by. And then these two kind of really solid looking guys, like muzhiki, were just walking by. And without even slackening their pace, one of them literally picked the guy up and moved him to one side. His little legs were still moving as if he was made of clockwork. And they just lifted him bodily, put him down like that, walked on. He said nothing. They said nothing, because obviously they had the strength in that situation. And I just thought, that is so bizarre.
Yeah, it is. And I think part of the way that we see how bizarre it is there's this family that moved to Russia, and the wife already recorded a video, and even Gary Kasparov wrote about it, and many other people as well. And it's hopefully a good example and a warning for people that Russia is not a happy place. Just because you may be like arch conservative and you don't think that any liberal values are a good thing, that doesn't mean that if you get rid of those things, you're going to have a happy place.
Yeah.
And then
But at least you only have 2 boxes on the form, male, female. You have 2 toilets. Things are simpler, though. I mean, on one level.
exactly. And isn't that what makes life great? What, Jonathan, I wanted to ask you about the drone academy in Russia, if you could talk about that.
This I find extraordinary. So let's start with, and I think it's appropriate to start with what the drones are used for. So we are seeing manually operated drones carrying out a so-called human safari in Kherson region, especially. It's kind of all over, but it's especially Kherson. And they basically train up their drone operators who are then going to be targeting military targets, but they use civilians in Kherson city as practice targets or just for entertainment. So there's literally hunting and maiming and killing people in, and they don't distinguish between adults and children. So they use humans to train their military. Now they're going one step further. They're using teenagers to train the future AIs that they want to use in their drones to scale up and semi-automate the process. So you now have a drone academy where teenagers are quite clearly told what they're going to be doing. But what they do is they fly drones, both sort of so they'll be at sort of these virtual computer consoles, but they're flying real drones in the field, testing field, which will then drop payloads onto particular targets. And what they want to do is to check the accuracy. They want to check the weight ratios of the drones and the damage impact, do a damage impact assessment. This isn't Ender's Game, if you know that science fiction book. This isn't a game where the kid's being told it's a game and they're kind of then using the data. No, they're telling the kids that they're training AIs to kill Ukrainians. And they're quite explicit about that. So, yeah, that's why I got the title of the episode, Killing Kids and Training Kids to Kill Kids. Russia has become not just a place where life is cheap, but an actual death cult.
The Russian culture, it trains, ingrains into people the idea of you are there to serve the state, whether it is in school where you're supposed to say the right answers or you're wrong, whether you're supposed to, go to work and do your thing and be quiet and follow the instructions, go to the army, follow instructions. And everything that Russia produced and developed was war. For war purposes. And so war industries were developed more than any others. And this is why Russia has more engineers and more has of those precise sciences, because that's what you need to build the rockets. And that's all makes sense. So really, this is just the next generation in this kind of exploitation of population, where you use them in any way you can, because they're really disposable material. Again, when you don't have democracy, and this is ultimately what I feel that Putin and dictators, I guess, just operate in this climate of lack of consequence, this total impunity. Because if there were elections, there would be people who would say, I don't want my child doing this, and they would step up, or at least vote and have a chance to do something. The question that I have for you, perhaps bigger one than the drone academy, is, can Russia be democratized? Because had a stream today with Aider Mujdabayev, and he is pretty strongly convinced that democracy is not Russian path, and everything that we do, in statements by whether Democrats or Republicans about engaging Russia are fundamentally wrong. Because when you have drone academy like the one you're describing, how are you supposed to do business with those people?
I fundamentally think that it's not that Russians are genetically incapable of democracy, because that would be, that would be verging into unscientific, I would say, racist territory, and that's not where I want to go with this. So I don't want people to get the wrong idea. But Russia is a multinational imperial project. There are many dozens of different nationalities. within the Russian Empire. There are many, many dozens of cultures and languages that have already been genocided in the process of building and constructing that empire. There are many countries that could have been viable countries with much larger populations, including Ukraine. I mean, if Ukrainians hadn't been slaughtered wholesale and then the Second World War happened, it's quite possible Ukraine's population could be double what it is now. I mean, it really is on that scale, and almost every other ethnic region has suffered similarly, a sort of decimation of their populations. So it is this almost unnatural entity in terms of its sheer size. We think of it as being rich because of hydrocarbons, but it's not. I mean, Ukraine is rich in its soil and its agriculture. Russia has fairly poor quality soil and fairly unforgiving climate across its vast territories. So it's an empire that is naturally, somewhat poor until the hydrocarbon economy came along. It always struggled to hold the state together. It always struggled to build the institutions which you would have in Western Europe. Therefore, when the army developed, it wasn't along the lines of being built on a class structure and having a pay structure to turn it into sort of professional body. It was based on the rather curious concept where a very feudal concept where your lords would basically be, well, they had their serfs, they had their own sort of slave populations, but they would be given the right to kind of farm parts of the economy. I call it tenured thievery. It's a way, because when they talk about corruption, people make the mistake of thinking of corruption as an aberration in Russia. No, it is actually part of the foundation of the system, giving
It's
people the right.
it's almost like tips in the
It's like
sense.
it, yeah. But it's in return for your fealty, your loyalty, you give someone permission to basically thieve a certain part of society, a certain part of the ecosystem, and that's never really gone away. I mean, they tried to tackle it in the Soviet Union. It kind of didn't work. It re-emerged with a vengeance, especially in the 60s and the 70s and 80s. And now I think the economy has lurched back to being essentially based on kind of systemic theft. So will democracy emerge in that? Well, no, it can't, as long as you have an entity and a people that are committed to being an imperial project. That rests on sort of suppressing, crushing, and lying about the other nationalities and cultures that form part of it. And the entire political architecture is based on essentially a hydrocarbon economy, which requires a small elite, a large security service, and a fairly extractive, parasitical mindset, which is exactly how they're approaching Ukraine. It's
I think
a
that
parasitical process.
the only thing that I can add to everything that you said, because I agree with it, is that there's a sense of Russian superiority that underpins all of this.
Yes.
Because why are you all so lame? Because we're so great. And why are we so great? Because we have great Russian culture.
Yes.
And it's a kind of a dead end of an argument, but I think that's what they find as a justification for anything. Because
this is intrinsic. Again,
yes,
it's as if that's come from the people. I'm starting to change my view on this. If you're going to operate, a mafia-run gas station or the czarist version of that, if you're going to run an entirely hierarchical, parasitic state, you actually can't do that unless you create a narrative that keeps the majority of the population, who are frankly surplus to requirement until you need their meat for the army. You need to create a set of ideas that's going to keep that population compliant, and that includes the intellectuals as well. So I actually rather think the sort of manufacturing and the promotion of the culture and this sort of lack of humility and hubristic, exceptional attitude, that's kind of there, but I think it is weaponized and it is fed by the state, because that's exactly the mindset you need to hold this entity together.
well, and it's based on greed and fear. But we have a viewer who says, sounds like American exceptionalism. And to that, I say, both United States and Soviet Union were involved in Korea. but Soviet Union generated North Korea and United States South Korea. So yes, we are definitely involved, and we're definitely think that we're special. Although after this president, I don't know how special we feel anymore. Russians feel
Like,
special
ask
no
people,
matter what.
Japan and Germany, American exceptionalism, great. Japan and Germany, two of the greatest democracies on the planet. You also mentioned South Korea as well. Not such a long history of a democracy, but it is now a vibrant democracy. America, in the wake of World War II, architected and with the British the system to turn two imperialistic totalitarian societies that committed horrific crimes, transform them into two of the most vibrant democracies on earth. So those who have disdain for the US need to ask themselves that question. Well, if the US is so bad, how did it manage to do that? Okay, Afghanistan and Iraq were a total fudge up. But then those two countries probably didn't have an awful lot of democratic foundation to build. And it's a different generation, the Second World War generation. So if America is so fundamentally wrong and broken, how did it manage to achieve something so extraordinary? And then the relative peace. Again, people say, what do you mean the peace of the post-Second World War? Well, compared to other periods of human history, we are coming out of an exceptional period of progress, peace, and prosperity that has been built under Pax Americanus. You're muted again.
I have a bit of a cold, so rather than sniffle and cough into the microphone, I just mute myself. It was great because on an earlier stream, I shifted to my guest and then I sneezed, and that was heard. And my guest was like, so people are like, bless you, right in the chat. That's great. Very sweet. We have wonderful community. But a question that I have for you, since you're in Ukraine and corruption is something that we already brought up, but in Ukraine, they've been having protests about their corruption efforts because there was a law passed that seemed like it was maybe, I don't know, changed, recalled. I got confused. I don't pay attention to Ukrainian politics, but the idea that people are concerned that people were protesting did register. And of course, Marjorie Taylor Greene goes, see, Ukrainian people want peace. So like, what are you seeing? What's going on?
I mean, it's certainly nothing to do with the war, and these protests have absolutely nothing to do with being against the war. In fact, I think the general awareness amongst Ukrainians is that corruption, the deep struggle with corruption is going on, and it doesn't stop. But really, it's going to have to wait to the end of the war to really get to grips with it. So I think when you talk to Ukrainians, they're like, well, when this is over, there's going to be a reckoning. And with the last vestiges of the Soviet mindset and the last vestiges of the oligarch class, there's going to be a major reckoning with that. But right now, the struggle is, and again, the Western press has been appallingly awful in trying to interpret what's going on. This is not the population challenging the legitimacy of Zelensky's government. And I think people have sort of misunderstood that. They're saying that the government is there at the behest of the people. We're in exceptional circumstances, but we need to remind the government occasionally, especially when it does things that seem to break a kind of implied social contract, when it does things that are quite clearly against the will of the people and against the will of the nation, and that as expressed in the last in Maidan and of course the last election, then they need to give the government a little bit of a nudge and remind them who put them in that place, and remind them that if they go too far from the will of the people, then they're not above being Maidaned, whether it's war, peace, or anything else.
And that's a wonderful reminder to Zelensky that should he decide to sign an agreement that people will not support with Russia, they will let him know about it.
He'll be gone. The minute he does something that the majority of the population think go against their interest, he'll be gone, because Ukrainians do not hold him up to be a saint or a martyr or some sort of mythical figure. And I think our politics in the West has become infantilized. Not only has it become partisan, we need to see
infantilized. That's a beautiful word.
Yeah. But we need devils and angels. We need simplistic narratives. We almost need sort of Marvel level sort of narrative complexity or shallowness.
Yes, I love
And
confusing if I speak to a group of Americans and I figure that I have to explain to them the complicated situation with Zelensky, whom,
yeah,
of course, my audience, if they support Ukraine, they feel that the
yeah.
Zelensky is amazing. And I
He's a
go,
good guy.
well,
He's a good guy. So where's the problem? You know?
right. I go, okay, let's start with this. Ukrainians don't like their leaders. Period. They
Yeah.
just don't respect them, no matter who, whether it's Kuchma, you pick one. They are just not popular. Ukrainians don't trust their leaders. Oh, that
They
seems healthy.
tolerate them. They
It's
tolerate them
healthy.
for a while, just as long as they don't, mess
Right.
up
But there's
too badly.
consequences of this, and that's what
Yeah.
we're part of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing. I mean, the essence of democracy is removing a leader, is not necessarily electing a leader. It's the ability to remove a leader. What Russia shows us is that it has never had a democratic transition in its entire history. Yeltsin kind of deposed Gorbachev, although it happened in an interesting way. And there's a lot of weird stuff that happened behind the scenes
I think there were
with the
like 2
KGB.
years of democracy, 91 to 93, and like 6 months of democracy in 1917.
Yeah. But in that 3 years, they managed to shell the parliament building.
That was the end.
They managed to hack the election, and all the way through, a faction of the KGB were kind of supporting Yeltsin anyway. So it's like, democracy.
You're
Yeah,
right. And that brings me to this question. When I talk to Vitaly Portnikov, one of the things that he's amazing, but he can change his kind of point of view because part of what makes him amazing. And I'm kind of getting confused, and so I'm asking different people. Is Ukraine fighting for, like, if it's not fighting for democracy, but it's fighting for survival, which is what Vitaly said at some point? I go, well, yeah, that makes sense. Elections, we don't want genocide. That seems kind of primary. But then on
yeah.
the other hand, he said in a recent video, so I'm going to have to ask him next time I talk to him, he was saying, which is also makes a lot of sense, that if Ukraine is not democratic, then what's the difference between Ukraine and Russia? And I'm going, oh, okay. So what is Ukraine supposed to be? Is Ukraine fighting for survival, or is Ukraine fighting for
I mean,
democracy?
that's to say that Ukraine could become Russia, and actually, I don't think it could. I don't
Even if
think
it
it
had,
is,
like,
and
no
I don't think it
not
could.
democratic Ukraine would still be, well,
It would no longer be Ukraine. But I just think, from everything I've seen, I see no path for a reemergence of Yanukovych unless it was imposed from outside through conquest. I don't see a process whereby a Yanukovych-style regime could reestablish itself. That would rely on reversing the economy to being essentially, oligarchs being at the core of it, because that's how you need to run that kind of hierarchy, and it would require the wholesale theft of everything back into a small number of hands. No, the war has kind of reversed that process, and oligarchs have considerably less power now than they did at the start of the full-scale war. And actually, a couple of the biggest ones have fled the country because, of course, they were in cahoots with the Russians. The other ones who are not trusted anymore because they had dealings with Yanukovych, and anyone who was in the party regions, in the minds of most Ukrainians, is tainted. They will never knowingly vote in somebody who formerly aligned with Russian politicians or as Russian assets. That simply won't happen anywhere, and that's not just here. That's throughout the country, pretty much. And I don't see a process where the whole economy will be stolen back wholesale by people who are assets and agents. It just will not be tolerated. So I don't see it. I don't see that kind of happening.
but what
And
do you
even
feel that for Ukrainians it is more about the survival, or it is about the style of government?
uh,
Or is it the same thing?
it's the same thing. Just as Russia believes it's existential for it to either be an empire and feared or not to exist, for Ukraine to not have agency, or their volia, is also to not exist. So I think in the minds of many Ukrainians, if they were no longer democratic or if their democratic agency wasn't expressed, in their minds, that would also no longer be Ukraine.
It's very interesting. Jonathan, thank you so much to you for your time, and thanks to our wonderful listeners and viewers. Make sure to press like, subscribe, but also leave a comment. I feel like we touched on a lot of things, that a lot of nerves, that if you have a nerve to let us know what you think, now it's your turn, because we're done here. Thank you,
That's a
Jonathan. Have a safe
potpourri,
travel from
potpourri of
Odessa.
topics. I raise my look at this. I don't want to taunt you with this, but I've got my traditional kvass here, which I'm now going to enjoy.
Oh, that's perfect. Well, you have a wonderful evening with kvass in Odessa, and we'll see you next time. Take care,
See
everyone.
you next time. Cheers.